Welcome to the About Sex podcast. I'm your host, Angela Skirtu, and you can find me at www.aboutsexpodcast.com. And you can also find me at www.therapistsinstlouis.com. Now, with me today is Worner Leland. Yes, and Worner is a queer, non-binary human, like this, I'm going to read it all, that spends their time on LGBTQIA affirming research and on sex education. They are a Board Certified Behavior Analyst with Empowered, a Center for Sexuality in St. Louis, Missouri, with Upswing Advocates in Chicago, Illinois. They are the current Research and Dissemination Liaison of the Sexual Behavior Research and Practice SIG of ABAI.
It's so many letters, yeah.
There are too many letters. A leader of Sex Positive St. Louis and a co-founder of the St. Louis Non-Monogamy Connection.
Correct,
Good.
yeah.
And you prefer they.
They, them pronouns.
I saw
That's
it
me.
because it was written in, but I wanted to understand. I wanted to clarify. Like, this is how you have the conversation for my audience. What's your pronoun?
Yeah, absolutely. What pronouns do you use?
Yes, that's a good way to do it. Mine is just she. Oh, I'm like, you can call me whatever. You can say, hey, you. I don't care.
Good. Appreciate it.
All right, now before we get into this next conversation, I just want to stop to give us a word from our new sponsors. So I am now working with a really cool company called Let's Get Checked. You can find them at trilgc.com/staykinky. What's really cool about this company actually is that they're doing testosterone testing for men and hormone checks for men and women. A lot of people are struggling with hormonal imbalances and reduced testosterone levels, which really can impact your sex life. And so more and more men and women are trying to test their hormone levels to see how they're doing. 1 in 4 men over 30 are actually low in testosterone. Symptoms you might want to look at include fatigue, erectile dysfunction, low sex drive, anxiety, brain fog, even having a hard time making decisions, which is basically most of my client population. Just teasing. But I mean, enough of you who come see me are actually really struggling with testosterone levels and your sex drive. So what's cool about this group is you can pick from either a male hormone test kit, a female hormone test kit, or an STD test kit. And what's really cool is they send it right to you in your home. You do what you need to do to take the test. And depending on what test you use, you'll either have to do a blood sample or a blood sample and a urine sample. And then you send it back and everything's completely confidential. And basically, they deliver it to your home, they collect your sample, they review your results for you. So depending on what happens with your test, they may provide a prescription in some cases. Usually it would only be for something like if they're treating STDs. If you do end up having something longer term like hormone therapy, then you'll likely be referred to a longer term provider. But at least you'll know where you stand. So it's really cool. Your results are available and they'll be reviewed by a physician. And then a nurse will contact you for a consultation over the phone. The Let's Get Checked laboratories are CLIA approved and everything is completely anonymous. So again, that website is trylgc.com/staykinky and use the coupon code STAYKINKY to get 20% off. Well, so tell me a little bit about what you do and why you do it.
Oh
We'll start just very broad.
I mean, I do a myriad of things.
Yeah, clearly. I had to read a lot there.
Yeah.
It's okay.
I mean, really pretty much anything centered on affirmation and autonomy for folks is something that I love deeply. And as much as that can be focused around sex, relationships, and health and harm reduction in all of those components, that tends to be where I gravitate. So I am part-time in Chicago, Illinois at Upswing Advocates. We do predominantly trans-affirming research and education, but it also spans a wide range of sexual health and LGBTQIA issues and work. And then here in St. Louis, I'm at Empowered, a Center for Sexuality, and we do predominantly affirming work with folks that want to work on any sort of behavioral concerns or skill building as it pertains to sex, relationships, friendships.
You just spend a month in Chicago and a month here, or do you do it in between week and weekends?
Yeah,
oh, okay.
Yeah. It's pretty variable. Upswing has gotten to the point where most of our things are contained and ready to go. So it's just I travel to go present things at this point and then run research.
Now.
Yeah. Well, and a lot of the research we can do long distance at this point.
Well, and I
nice.
saw in your thing that you're going to present at ASECT. ASECT is the national certification for sex educators, counselors, and therapists. So you're going to be one of the presenters this year.
Yes, that is happening.
What are you presenting on?
We are talking about trans and intersex-centric sex education across the lifespan. So if you're very, very, very lucky, you might get some sex education that's inclusive, and we'll like briefly touch on trans issues or intersex issues, but it's very rare to find any sort of education that's like central to the knowledge that you need as a trans person or an intersex person or both for your sexual health. And if you do get that, it's still very like K through 12 geared, and there's so much early education and then just across the lifespan stuff, you know, that we all deal with that it's really valuable to have actual guidance on.
Like what's an example? You know, just what kinds of things? I know there's a billion things you could use guidance on, but like just some 2 or 3 basic things that are like really common that people are going through that it's like, oh, thank God you're here.
Oh, yeah. I mean, so absolutely early education, when we start to think about consent and body autonomy, so many intersex infants still have surgeries performed on them. You know, obviously non-consensually, they're infants. Oh, yeah, that's a thing that's still prominent here in the U.S. Human rights groups are starting to speak out against it more, but very common that to avoid what many doctors will label as like unnecessary confusion or bullying or all of these sort of made up problems that exist socially, will elect to perform surgeries on someone that has genitalia that maybe doesn't align with a binary gender, and then will assign that child a gender at birth.
So they choose it, and the child doesn't have any choice in what happens. What are the outcomes of that?
Oh, I mean, so it's super harmful, obviously, right? To have invasive surgery at the infancy stage. But also many folks will not be told about this, will undergo like endocrine therapy throughout their lifespan. But it's very like hush hush, and many folks not until far later in life will find out that this was even sort of what was going on for them or why.
Oh, wow. So it's all hidden from them too, so they don't have any...
frequently.
So then what's the impact? What do you see as the impact on that? I've actually not heard many stories on this, so I'm kind of really interested now.
This is
I'm interested about everything, but
issue.
Yeah.
Well, so that's like solely related to if you have external genitalia that maybe don't fall within a binary norm. But there are like 23 different sort of umbrella intersex differences or conditions, as they're labeled these days, with all sorts of variability underneath them. So if you have a chromosome difference or a hormone difference, or, you know, all of these things, it can impact your life to varying degrees. And definitely if you were assigned a gender that is not your gender and underwent surgery, this can, you know, impact sexual health, sexual functioning later in life, but also just sense of self-identity, feelings of autonomy and safety in your own body across time. Like that's a very violating thing, and especially if it's been hidden from you your whole life.
Yeah, absolutely.
So all sorts of really impactful things, a lot of really beautiful advocacy. Interact is a beautiful youth group that focuses on intersex-related issues in the U.S. Pigeon out of Chicago does a lot of advocacy to end intersex surgeries. Lurie's Children's Hospital is a space that does still perform that work sometimes, and so a lot of advocacy is done there. And there are definitely folks that are moving away from this, but to not have any access to like the knowledge that was even something that happened to you, and then like how to feel good in your body, how to interact with a body that doesn't feel like your own. Yeah, that doesn't feel like your own, just as a human in the world. So maybe you're not intersex, but like how to interact with an intersex body. It's statistically as common as having red hair to have a difference of sex development or an intersex condition.
That's interesting. I've never heard that.
Super prominent, yeah. Between like 1 and 3%, I believe, is the range of citations you'll find in some of the research. So
it's such a common thing for it to have so little, I guess, access and resource and like ability to kind of explore that. You know, you say you do a little bit of a lot of sex education, but like to not even have a whole section of sex education for themselves.
That even touches on this, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Or also like how to interact with somebody that has a body that doesn't fall into those, you know, neat binaries either. Like that's a whole entire other conversation that would be so easy to just like include affirmation for.
It's such a great idea.
Easy to be like, you know, not all bodies look exclusively like this. Well,
you know, I don't remember what research I was looking at, but it was saying that people struggle people struggle with something that they can't quite categorize. And so like some of the research was suggesting how well people do like in life is directly correlated with their ability to handle things that they can't categorize, like their ability to get comfortable with like, instead of having like, no, you have to be this, you have to be this thing, and that's what you are, like you're a girl and you're like, this is what you do. Like, and so like a person's ability to kind of actually develop comfort in that actually is kind of correlated with their ability to be successful in life. So I thought that was kind of cool.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like general psychological flexibility, right?
Yes.
It's like such a valuable trait to have, and it absolutely ties into like your rigidity or not around things like gender and sexuality and how all of these things intersect with one another.
So something I was really interested because I read my mistake. They gave me a lot of very interesting things about yourself. And so I'm really curious about, okay, so you mentioned sexual tools and sex toys as therapeutic devices. So I'm really curious how you use sex toys as a helpful tool in therapy.
Yeah, absolutely. That is one of my favorite things to talk about.
Awesome. Let's learn all about it.
I was working at a feminist sex toy shop as I was getting my master's degree in applied behavior analysis, and spent a large portion of my time just doing, it feels so much like consultation work, honestly. Like people come in with a wide variety of, anxieties or fears or questions or, excitement, all sorts of things that, you just like on the floor as a salesperson basically are holding space for and providing consultation around. And most of the people that I worked with were also pursuing some sort of, helping profession degree at the master's or PhD level at that time too. So it was very highly educated and sex positive environment with a lot of folks that very much were interested in like, how is this, going to be something that's beneficial to your life in general? And we would so frequently get people that were sent to the shop by their therapists, whether that be couples
like you need to go there.
Sincerely though, yeah.
No, that's good.
Yeah, absolutely. And for a wide variety of reasons. But we would often get couples, whether there be like desire discrepancy or just like shifts in their sexual interest over time or boredom with the sex that they've been having for the past 20 years, or like, hey, we're in our 80s now and our bodies, don't self-lubricate the way that they used to in the past. All of these things that can really impact sexual functioning. And so sex toys can be like such a meaningful way to explore interpersonal sexuality and build pleasure for folks that were hoping to like remain in a monogamous relationship, but also like really variable amounts of desire, like learning how to enjoy your own body and to have like healthy masturbation practices that aren't like stepping outside of your relationship is a really valuable tool. So all of that is really meaningful. A lot of talking about overdiagnosis, or what I personally would classify as misdiagnosis of, sexual problems.
I
that
gotcha.
we see in the DSM that really often, in my personal opinion, can be just like variable interests in sex that then get diagnosed as like a problem.
We'll even think of desire and arousal disorders as a basic one. I mean, there's so much to that diagnosis because it depends on, do I like this person that I'm having sex with? Are we erotically engaged in some way? Is my mind involved, or am I just so busy working I don't think about, it's just, there's so much variance. And I think that one definitely gets overdiagnosed or overused when really, I mean, I think people just need to understand their bodies.
Absolutely. And then so frequently, just like we would see heterosexuals, couples come in where like the concept of sex is that very linear narrative of like maybe a little bit of foreplay and penetrative sex, and then sex is over. It's like, oh, okay, well, you're not really
like, oh, you don't know what good sex looks like, do you?
And so frequently it's like, well, there are, toys and tools that absolutely can shift what some of that looks like for you, potentially. So,
well, I think that's a big reason why a lot of people in heterosexual relationships, females particularly, don't have orgasms. Because they don't understand their bodies. And it's that sort of, like you said, there's a little bit of foreplay and then it's penetration. And that was supposed to work out for you, but it really isn't.
Absolutely. Yeah. So that was just like such a big part of it. And then also just considering like solo sex as well, and knowing your body and what your body likes. And we often talk about like sexual tools and toys and how there's like such an overlap there, because there are so frequently that's where you go for like gender affirming devices as well. So whether that be like chest binders or packers. So dildos that aren't for penetration or play, but are just for gender affirmation that sort of emulate a flaccid penis.
Okay, I was going to say, will you explain what's a chest binder or a packer? Because you guys aren't all my clients. Not all my listeners actually know what those are.
Yeah, absolutely. So a packer would just be something that would emulate a flaccid penis that somebody could wear for gender affirming purposes throughout the day. Some of them have the capacity of what's called STP, stand to pee. So you could use them at a urinal. Some don't. Some are just aesthetically and sort of psychologically affirming to wear. Chest binders are typically used for folks that have chests that don't want the appearance of breasts, but who maybe don't have access to something like a gender affirming surgery. But it would minimize that appearance.
Something for people to be aware of, it's kind of expensive. A lot of the, for people who are going through transitions, there's a lot of the surgeries or the options are not covered through insurance. Even something as simple as laser hair removal that somebody might want to, have more clean skin instead of having to shave a beard if you don't identify as male, for example. It's a very expensive thing to get laser hair removal. And so, just having options and it's very expensive to get breast augmentation of any kind, whether it's lowering or upping.
Absolutely.
And if they don't always, insurances don't always consider it, what's the word when they cover it? They don't consider
medically
it
necessary.
Medically necessary. They consider it, what's the opposite? Plastic or something?
Like elective or cosmetic.
I don't know. I can't think of those words right now, but those are what I'm...
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm not big in surgery right now. Next year when I get my money. But
it's so expensive. There are so many barriers to access it. So cisgender folks that want these procedures for elective or cosmetic reasons often face far less barriers than folks that have medically necessitated reasons for seeking these surgeries.
Well, and even to be fair, seeking therapists that are LGBTQIA friendly, that can be a barrier too, because sometimes they're private pay as opposed to doing insurance. So there's a lot of barriers.
Yeah, absolutely. And so if you were to get access to something like affirming hormone therapy, sometimes, if you're very lucky and have affirming medical providers, you can use an informed consent model and sort of demonstrate in the room with your physician that you have the capacity to consent, that you understand all of the changes, whether they're going to be permanent or temporary, reversible or not, and access that. Many people, though, do have to go through long therapeutic processes to prove, that they're experiencing some sort of distress related to their gender. And then if you're wanting surgery, absolutely, you have, a couple of years of therapy and proving, and a lot of what historically has been gatekeeping, to access these things. So for many folks, just access to basic tools like a chest binder or a packer might be all they really have access to for a long period of time.
Which really impacts their mental health and well-being.
Yeah.
To feel like you can present as what you feel you're supposed to present as.
Absolutely. And then some people just don't want surgery. Totally valid, to be a trans person where that's reasonable. Not what you want.
No, because it's a lot of risk and it can impact sexual function in some cases. So I understand that.
Yeah. And also then fluidity, the ability to change day to day, perhaps, you don't completely want to eliminate the experience of having breasts, but some days that's not something you're wanting, so having that option is really valuable. So
one of the things that's on this list that I'm really curious about is harm reduction.
Yes.
And it's mentioned in two ways. She mentioned, I'm so sorry.
Right.
I'm going to just call you Worner.
I
know, great practice opportunities. Well, and I'm modeling too. You can make a mistake, but you should own when you've made a mistake with somebody when they've already identified their gender that they prefer or their pronouns. So I do want you all to understand, that's the way I screw up and say, I'm sorry, I'm screwing this up.
And I screw this up too all of the time. It's a fluency thing, right?
If you haven't had access to that opportunity. Well, so anyhow, I'm interested in harm reduction in terms of sex ed and kink, but kink first. Because I already talked about sex ed today. So, talk about how you help people with harm reduction and kink.
Oh my goodness. Well, so
unpack everything.
So first of all, I would like to shout out the Kink clinician guidelines that just got published December 2019. So yes, so many clinicians involved in this. I highly recommend visiting kinkguidelines.com. First of all, you can access for free like the full guidelines, which is beautiful, but also all of the information about the people involved is there. But based originally off of a paper that Dr. Peggy Kleinplatz and Charles Moser wrote. Just wanted to make sure I got that correct because they very much were at the helm of this project. And so much of it centers around all of the things that are so important for clinicians to consider when we think about kink. And so when I think about harm reduction, I definitely think about focusing on things like consent, being able to distinguish consensual kink interactions from abuse, which is something that a lot of clinicians like will raise concerns about. I think about like the harms of social stigma, and then I also think how that can impact therapeutic practices and the harm that we can inflict on our clients potentially by failing to hold affirming spaces for them as clinicians. So,
where you basically the way that can look is somebody comes in and they're saying, I have a kink relationship, and they are having a consensual kink relationship, but you as a therapist are maybe saying, I don't know if there must be something wrong with you, or kind of like assuming there's some sort of problem when that's not where you're coming in for in therapy. You're coming in to just discuss maybe this one portion of the issue. So like being very open and accepting essentially of somebody who is living a kink lifestyle, whatever that looks like for them, and not assuming kind of stigma or some sort of trauma or, all of the ways that therapists kind of do that.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. So, and the guidelines, it's just everything you're mentioning, have little sections that touch on all of these things because they're all really critical components that are important to be considering.
So what's a typical reason somebody might need to talk about kink with you?
So I typically work with neurodivergent clients, folks that are often not their own legal guardians. So I often don't have a lot of folks that are just like talking about their kink lifestyles or even have access to that. So that'll come out in really different ways. But I would say on the whole, when folks are disclosing kink relationships, whether it be to like a clinician or a therapist or a counselor, or even just a friend, it can be just some like information about their life to give you a more robust picture of what's going on. It might be because there's something related to it that they wish to discuss. So often there can be like a lot of internalized shame or guilt or stigma or like, hey, the people in my life are not affirming of this, but it's really important to me. Like lots of things surrounding the social aspects and like negative social implications of that lifestyle that maybe folks want space for.
What do you think are the negative social impacts? Like, what are you seeing?
Oh my goodness. It's, it all really comes back to like misinformation and stigma. And for a lot of people, like kink play or, like more taboo sexual practices can sort of on the surface look like harm potentially to people. And if you're a person that's experienced harm, that can be really triggering. It can be really hard to conceptualize that someone would elect or, be enjoying, something like a physical impact, like being hit or being spanked. And that's very much like the physical interactions too. There are all sorts of other non-physical types of kink play. There's, sexual kink play. There's asexual kink play. There's a wide range of behaviors that can really fall under what kink even is for someone. And the specificity of it, if it's unfamiliar, can be, I think, scary for people. And I think instead of really like listening and understanding that people have the option to engage in it, the two main sort of like theoretical practices right now are either as a leisure activity. It maps perfectly onto what leisure is for most people.
I just do it on the side.
Sure, absolutely. And then also there's a school of thought that views it also almost as like akin to a sexual orientation as well.
Where they're living a life pretty regularly that incorporates whatever that kink is.
Yeah.
Yes? Okay.
Yeah. But the inability to really conceptualize in those ways and instead of stigmatize, because these were things, at one point in the DSM, diagnosable as mental conditions or assumed to be related to trauma or abuse. that's the potential to cause a lot of harm if that's the mindset that you're coming from when really somebody's engaging in like a leisure activity.
Well, and I've even noticed, so I have extra terms I add that aren't necessarily anywhere, they're just mine, but I consider things like BDSM light or kink diet kink.
Sure.
Because there's levels. I've noticed that a lot of times people are engaging in levels of it. And it's just not, because there's stereotypes or stigma around what it looks like. Like, for example, that movie, what was it, 50 Shades of Grey, which I know there's a lot of debate. I'm not using this as an example, but I'm just explaining that, like, I think that was a cultural reference recently. And as a result, people developed a lot of views or values around what they thought kink looked like or BDSM looked like, right? And so as a result, you know, I'll be in the office talking to people and I'm like, oh, you're engaging in like kink light, you know? And they're like, what? No. But it's like, well, you kind of are. And so even explaining that there are ways that people kind of dabble. So there's the leisure where it's like, oh, I must do this every time. And then there's like, every now and then I like to get spanked. Every now and then I like to get tied up, or I really like leather. Not all the time, but they don't have to have it like for every single interaction. And so I kind of consider that like your kink light or your diet BDSMs.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I feel like it can be harmful too to just like close yourself off to letting yourself explore whether that's something you would like or not. So if you try it and you don't like it, then don't do it again. That's, you know, absolutely fine. Exactly. But I think, you know, that there's such harm from these sort of social connotations too, that shuts people off from being like allowed to like play or explore things that might be meaningful for them.
Yeah. Well, and that's part of, I think that's even, like you said, it's part of an expanding sexuality, is sometimes you do get bored with certain kinds of sexual routines. And if it always looks a certain way, then exploring different concepts in kink or BDSM can actually be really nice.
Yeah, absolutely.
And be lovely.
And so there's like a little bit of like harm reduction terminology that gets thrown around. It used to be safe, sane, consensual would sort of be like the umbrella term. These days you hear a lot more about like risk-aware consensual kink. Okay. So moving away from this idea that you have to be like diagnosably sane, or the idea that people that are like neurodivergent, or if you happen to have like a mental illness or see a therapist, that maybe you shouldn't be engaging in this at all, right? Like
the non-clinical way of saying is we're all crazy, get over it.
Yeah, so like risk-aware consensual kink absolutely embodies some harm reduction practices. So if you are engaging in any sort of play, really, there's going to be some inherent risk. Even if you're engaging in vanilla sex, you know, some non-kink sex, there's some risk involved, right? And some potential for harm, you know, interpersonally, physically, always. So having knowledge, being educated on what you're doing, being equipped with any sort of tools that you would need for safety, really considering like if you are engaging in some play that's like heavier, has the potential for more bodily damage, like does everybody involved have insurance? No, but sincerely, like
that's a reasonable request.
You know, like what do you want to happen if, you know, something isn't going right? Like hopefully everything is set up to where it always does. You know, making sure that you're playing with people that you feel safe about, that you've checked in and negotiated ahead of time, that folks have safe words, that those safe words are always honored. You know, all of these are harm reduction practices.
Well, and those are conversations around consent too. It sounds like you're making very clear, one, of all the risks of doing, well, let's use impact play since you mentioned it. Impact play is some version of getting hit. Like spanking, it can be all butt related. Sometimes it's in other places too, correct? Like it can be impact in other parts of your body.
Yeah, and so this is a knowledge component, right? Like if you're playing with somebody that doesn't realize that the spine is going to be an unsafe space to hit you, you're at a far higher risk level and a far higher potential for harm. You know, a little bit of knowledge around safe body areas to hit versus not is going to do a lot to reduce that risk and reduce that harm.
What are the safer places to hit?
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm curious. Now I just have so many questions. That's why I want to talk about kink, because I haven't had a really good, like, in-depth kink conversation in a while. So I'm like, all right, like, where's a good place to be hit? So long as everybody's consenting and you've had all those conversations you described.
Yeah. So, I mean, I would say, first of all, this is just a brief overview. I highly recommend like actually looking for resources and building the skill set if you're engaging in this. But so most people like will stick to the butt or like upper thigh. Potentially you could do shoulders, upper arms, but places with more muscle and fat, you're going to want to stay away from bone. You're going to want to stay away from like places with nerves that you could potentially like hit or pinch. Yeah.
Okay.
So,
and I mean, some of the conversations may look at how heavy or how intensely you want to be hit, what objects you're going to be using.
Yeah.
I could go. I'm like, wait, hold on, Angela, take a step. No, but like, so these are the kinds of conversations that like when people, and this can be a flirtatious conversation too. So this is the challenge I think that everybody tends to have is they think of consent as this very business thing, but actually it can be a very sexual, flirtatious conversation around, well, this is how I like to be hit. But like, this is where I'm not okay with. So, like stop this here. But like, they can be flirty, they can be fun, but there do need to be very direct conversations where you're saying, hey, no hitting here. I don't want, if you don't want marks left, I don't want marks, or if I'm okay with marks here, but not okay here, because there's even context around that as well.
Absolutely.
I remember, I've had clients, multiple different kink clients, and I remember, I've always had that kind of risk assessment sort of thing too. And somebody was engaging in a form of like, I'd say a very rudimentary tattooing. That's how I would describe it. And I don't remember what it was called, but there was cutting happening in some form in the skin, and they were like making, I would say old-fashioned tattoos would be the best way to describe it. And my first thought was, do you have a medical book around just to make sure wherever you're, like you're not going too deep in the skin, like what are you, And so I wasn't trying to approach anybody in that situation like, this is horrible that you're doing this. What's wrong with you? It was more, okay, if you're going to engage in this, what are ways that we make sure that it's safe? Are you knowing different areas where there could be arteries or, because you could die in certain circumstances if you're not aware of the risk.
Sure, absolutely. And then like all of the harm reduction considerations for anything that's going to involve blood potentially in the first place too. So, do you have a safe way to dispose of these objects around you? Are you making sure that they are clean and sterile?
My next one was like, is it clean?
Yeah, like all of these are really real considerations.
No, do you have alcohol for right after this kind of thing occurs, so that you're making sure that it stays in? And then do you have access to a phone or doctor, medical? I didn't even think about medical insurance. It's like, oh, that's so smart.
Yeah, I mean, they're all things to consider, and these are conversations that are going to be variable, right? Like if you're maybe like doing like fuzzy handcuffs and some very light spanking in the bedroom, you're not maybe necessarily having these deeper
kink light I was talking about.
Conversations.
Yeah.
But if you're wanting to do something that involves like blood being drawn, that's a far riskier behavior.
Well, but to even throw in the whole thing, what are those wrist ties? I know of somebody who used those like, what are those tightening?
Like zip ties.
Zip ties. Somebody used zip ties, and they actually did scar because, so fuzzy handcuffs aren't going to create as much of a, like, that's why they're fuzzy. So that, when you're like, oh no, stop, it still feels good. But this person thought zip ties would be a good idea. And they have permanent scarring around their wrist from the zip ties because you got to think of the actions you take when you're having any sort of intercourse or we call it queer sex too, because queer sex can be all across the board. And I kind of think it's better sex, but that's just me. Anyhow, so when you're doing this and you're moving around, like there's a pulling on the skin, and that's something that it's a risk that even they weren't even thinking. They're like, oh, this is just tying ourselves up. It's not a big deal. Yeah. But there are some risks.
Absolutely. And that's why I always I'm a big advocate for like, Google whatever activity you're wanting to get into and Google that term plus BDSM and Google that plus BDSM and safety. Because
I love it.
Yeah, because truly there are so many resources out there and so many people that are willing to share their like, oops.
I kind of screwed this up. Because that's the thing is sometimes you get into it and you don't realize. I mean, I'm sure those people didn't know that was going to occur, you know?
And that's one that like in your head probably like sounds like it would be a little bit safer.
Yeah.
Right? Like you're not maybe drawing any blood.
I wouldn't have thought it either. No, when I heard it, I was like, oh, that's good to know for later.
Absolutely. But like the potential to cut off circulation, if you have people that you're playing with that have any sort of chronic illness, chronic pain, autoimmune disorders, physical disabilities, is shifting the potential for these harms too as well with the body.
So even going back to the sex toys that I also used to work in a sex store for a while before I got my degree. And I remember we had this conversation about like those cock rings, it's like, don't let them stay on there for longer than 30 minutes because you're cutting off blood circulation. And people don't always think about blood circulation.
People fall asleep in them. Like that's terrifying to
me. That is horrible.
Yeah.
But you really need that.
Right? Like how would you know if you don't know? And absolutely the same thing. Yes, if you're using cock rings, no longer than 30 minutes.
No longer than 30 minutes.
Should be gently snug, should never cause pain. Yeah.
Thank you.
But important,
Thank
right?
you.
Yeah.
And I will say, if you ever do go to a sex store, the people who work there tend to be the coolest people. They're people like us, actually. No, they are. Like, I was an aspiring sex therapist, and obviously you were too in some ways. So it's like, the people who work there tend to really care about sex. They tend to have tried the stuff, So I remember, like, that was a part of, like, helping people out was you were like, oh, this one works. Don't use this one. It's just not strong enough. I also learned that if you put a vibrator on the end of your nose, you can tell how strong it is. That was so fun.
That's going to be your most sensitive, like, just non-sexual body part.
Yeah. I know. It was so cool. I was like, I had no idea.
Yeah.
And even though I've talked about this all the time, I still have weird embarrassment around it. It's so fun.
But I feel like that's why it's so important to talk about too.
Absolutely.
Because like the more access you're getting to talking about it in the first place is going to reduce that embarrassment and pain that comes up with talking about it. Yeah. So whether you're a therapist or, just a human in the world, like it's so valuable.
So a lot of what you do, it can be kind of harm reduction, but just to explain, harm reduction is just looking at potential risk and making sure people are educated so they're making the best decisions. You may still get harm, you know, like impact play, for example. Yeah, it's going to be painful, but if that's what you want, then you can get something out of it. And as long as it's consensual, it's okay.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's a modality that really takes a look at a spectrum of choices from doing nothing to reduce your risk at one end to like abstinence of a harmful behavior totally on the other end, and says like, okay, so where are our fears around this behavior, right? Like what are our really real fears, and the hierarchy of those. Like death is going to be the biggest one, right? Like we want to make sure we're reducing the possibility of you dying in these situations. But then also looking at like all of the other harms and like what's going to be more harmful for one person in a situation is going to be, different than another person. So taking a look at all of those, physical factors, biological, psychosocial, sort of interpersonal things that have the potential for harm, and looking at like what's actually going to be harmful for you, what is going to reduce those risks for you in that moment, and really centering individual autonomy in those choices. So
I have a hard question, but or it could be easy for you. I don't know. How do you draw lines on whether it's abusive versus consensual kink?
Yeah, that's a really great question, right?
Everybody's wanting to know.
Yeah. So first of all, I would point you to those kink guidelines.
Sure.
Again, and no, but sincerely recommend taking a look at like that and the literature around this, because it's a really hard thing to hold space for. And especially if you're a therapist or a mandated reporter in any way, you really do have a serious duty to be critically assessing this. The main thing broached in the guidelines, because it doesn't delve super deeply into this, because there is not a ton of research on this right now, is noting that you can have abuse or intimate partner violence or domestic violence happening in a kink relationship. They're not the same thing, but they're not also independent of one another. Just because somebody is saying that they're doing kink doesn't mean that there isn't like abuse or harm happening in that situation. So it's important to note that like screeners for abuse there isn't anything really out there that's going to be easy as a checklist that takes into account the kink lifestyle. Like all of those questions are vague enough to where like you could be engaging in consensual healthy kink and be flagged for abuse versus not. So I think, the core things to look out for, first of all, are has there been negotiation ahead of time? Do you have a safe word? So like, do you have a way to get out of this situation that's always going to be honored versus not? In some research of folks that have done 24/7 lifestyle kink play, so I submit to you and your choices all of the time. I can't really say no. I want to say, I'll have to go back and look at those stats. But a significant number of folks said that they had been engaged in relationships previously like that, where like their safe words weren't honored. So when they had said like, no, time out, rubber ducky, whatever, the code word for, hey, we're actually stopping this right now, happened, that was not honored. It was blown past by the people with more power in that situation. So that's going to be a huge red flag, right? If your ability to opt out is removed. But then also I think failure to really ahead of time, be asking these questions about, like things that may actually cause some serious like physical or psychological, or interpersonal harm can also potentially be really big red flags as well.
I'm always looking for coercion too. It's a really hard one because it can be a little under the table. I've noticed that like people, so they'll overtly talk through some of this stuff, but there can be coercion around like, this is what I want, or I want it more. And like, so for example, I've had multiple kink couples, and I remember there was one situation where there wasn't some basic conversation around like female sexuality. Okay, so it was a heterosexual couple, but like what is normal female sexuality? Well, so I'm not saying everybody's, so I never generalize, but it'll sound generalized. I'm just gonna own it, right? But so quite a few women don't want to go straight for a blowjob. You know, like that doesn't mean you can't, but like sometimes you kind of need to, I don't know, have a conversation. Just like, hey, how you doing? How was your day? So going straight for this sense of like in a power dynamic, like, you need to go down on me right now. If that's not like already talked about and agreed upon, of like, yeah, that's something that actually works with me. Or, you know what, I thought that works for me in some circumstances, but in some other cases when I've had a bad day, I don't want you to I can't. I need there to be this space where I can say, nah, it's just not a good day. I do like it in some circumstances, for example, because there may be like a power dynamic of, it is exciting when you just tell me what to do, because there is an excitement there. But there has to be kind of an understanding around, like, there's certain levels of how people get sexual and what gets them into that space. And some of it can be the power dynamic, but some of it can just be basic, I need some buildup to get to this space. And if there's no understanding of that in me, then you can be kind of guiding me or coercing me into doing things for you that are still sexy in some ways, but they're not sexy in other ways. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And I think a big thing that comes up too is that it's important to know that that's not always malicious when that's happening. Sometimes.
Oh, no, I think it's not like it's unintentional. Yeah.
But like unintentional coercion is still coercion though. And I think that's the thing that people sometimes miss is like, maybe I'm doing this because I assumed you thought it was going to be hot. And we just never had a conversation about it.
Yeah.
So figuring out how to talk about these things and letting that still be sexy, but also letting it inform what's actually going on is so crucial to step away from some of these more harmful spaces or things that have the potential to be abusive.
I think also, even in relationships that aren't necessarily playing in kink, I've learned so many things from studying kink relationships and studying non-monogamous relationships actually, that really, for people who are in the vanilla realm, like they need this, because that unintentional coercion's happening there for people. And it often happens with, you didn't want to have sex with me, why don't you want to have sex? You know, like in just this sense of like how often they're doing it, how they're engaging, how they're initiating or not initiating. And that's why I guess it's my theme this year is like, where's coercion occurring? I'm sure a lot of times it's unintentional actually, but when people aren't made aware of how they can do that, then there can be, again, unintentional harm that's occurring that really causes people's desire to tank.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and this comes back to these conversations about desire discrepancy too, right? Like it's really hard to not have coercion on some level. Usually from both parties, if there's a discrepancy in what's wanted. Because, you know, if you love somebody and care about them, there's definitely a desire to like shift what you're doing to meet somebody's needs. And, you know, it gets really hard to know when that's crossing a line.
Yeah. You know, because there is drawing each other into things too, you know, like, so. Yeah.
Right, and this is in vanilla
like some
dynamics.
of it's not coercion, some of it's like enticing, right? You know, it's hard. It's hard to,
Yeah, and then so like considering that in vanilla spaces is a little bit easier, considering that in kink spaces. And then if you're holding spaces with, you know, a therapist or a counselor or whatever, that does get more sticky, right? So it's really challenging sometimes to be able to help people parse apart, you know, like, is this enticement? Is this coercion? Is this what you want? In what context is it what you want?
And then how am I just going to have good sex, damn it?
Right? Yeah, these are big conversations. It's a lot to consider.
You know, it's funny. So a weird sidebar, but like I've learned that as a result of people wanting to be respectful. So like most people are on the side of like, I care about you and I want to be good to you. And so I've seen that it can go in the opposite direction of people struggling to just own their sexuality as a result, because they're so worried about, I don't want to accidentally. And then they feel kind of frozen even in being able to initiate and start sexual interactions. Yeah. Have you seen that at all?
Sure, absolutely. It's a complicated
what do we
dynamic.
Do? So, okay, I want to talk a little about, you do behavioral analysis and sexual harm reduction. So talk about how those intersect.
Yeah, absolutely. So I am a deep believer in harm reduction as a modality for behavior analysis, and personally feel like it should be the only modality used.
Okay.
In line with our ethical values, simply because we have an ethical obligation to focus on client autonomy, right?
Okay.
Like, what are your individual values? How do we get you toward your goals?
Yeah, so you not telling somebody what to do, but like respecting where they're at, but then helping them to do it with the risk assessment.
Absolutely. Well, and then for so many folks that get behavior analytics services, it's often neurodivergent folks, often not their own legal guardians, or there are other people involved in their care. And so there's a lot of, again, usually not malicious in any way, but to some degree coercion of, you know, what your beliefs and your values and your behavior should look like from all of these people around you. And so helping somebody identify really like, no, what is you? What is your own individual value and goal here? What are you wanting in your world and your life? And then how does that tie to sexuality for you or relationships, whether they're sexual or or not, is a big part of that work.
So a big part of it, I mean, just another part of it is helping them develop their own autonomy, essentially.
Yeah, entirely. Yeah.
Do you have any hijinks with that?
Any hijinks with that?
No, I like that particular word.
Say more. What do you mean by
Tell me
hijinks?
your hijinks. Like struggles of, like, how do you find that struggle? Like, so the worldview around is, no, this is what it needs to be, but the person is developing an autonomy that's, I want it to be this way. So what hijinks ensue?
Oh my goodness. I mean, well, so it's interpersonal, so it's always hijinks, right? Like anytime that you have values diverging from somebody that you care about, that's a really hard thing to have going on. And if you're like the guardian of somebody or involved in the care of somebody that has values that are starting to diverge from your own, that's, that can be really incredibly challenging.
So what do you do to help them understand?
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of perspective taking. It's a lot of understanding that our primary client is our primary client. We're honoring their goals and their values, but that also we have a responsibility to them as like a human in the world and the people that are around them as well. So much of the work is direct work on, building your own autonomy, figuring out what you like and what you don't like, whether that be interpersonally, relationally, sexually or not, all of those things. But then also really working with, caregivers and, other vested parties on how do you hold affirming space for somebody when what they want isn't what you want necessarily. And that's a big part of it too. I would argue the more challenging part, truly.
I always feel like it is because, it's still hard to kind of figure out yourself for everyone. It's like, who am I? What do I want? What feels right to me is one path. But then it's, how do I either so if you have a little more self-control that's not the word I'm looking for. If you have a little more control in your life, then you can choose who to bring in to be your support so that you don't have to be fighting yourself constantly. Sure. But in cases like this, there's a caretaker who they have control in the situation sometimes. So it can be harder. So it's like, well, this is how I am, but this is who you are. And if they're not open or respecting or willing in any way to I could just see a lot of difficulty. I don't know why I'm using fingers, but
Yeah, no. Well, and it gets incredibly challenging, especially when we get into the adults who are not their own legal guardian realm as well, because a legal guardian does have the right to restrict your ability to have sex with someone.
Really?
Yes, absolutely. So if you are an adult but not your own legal guardian, you may be barred from ever engaging in sexual activity legally by that person. There's a lot of conversations around capacity to consent and what that looks like. I feel like there's a lot of fear and desire to protect people. I've never seen it coming from a malicious place. Again, it always seems to be coming from a place of care, but definitely overly restrictive in a lot of cases, and not really allowing for flexibility in somebody's skill set to change, so.
Yeah, well, and you just imagine yourself, somebody saying that to you. You're just never allowed to have sex with anyone. The end. The outrage. All right. I feel like I talked to you forever. I can't, though. So we are at the end of the podcast. My quick question is, what's a final piece of I know, you've got a lot of information, but this is your nugget to send to the world.
Oh my goodness.
I know, sum it all up in one sentence. No, I'm just kidding, but it's really, actually, that's what I'm asking you to do.
Yeah, truly. I would say that all of these conversations that we had around sex are so crucial to just day-to-day interactions. It's, it's really honoring consent, honoring autonomy, honoring perspective taking for different values. And so this is so doable across the lifespan. This is doable in all of your interactions that have nothing to do with sex ever. And the earlier we can, promote this, and the more frequently we can promote this just across space and time, I think the better off we're all going to be in being able to be good to one another.
Thank you for coming on, Worner. And you are with Empowered, a Center for Sexuality in St. Louis, Missouri. And how can they find you?
That is empoweredcenter.com.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me. And I am Angela Skirtu. You've been listening to www.aboutsexpodcast.com. And you can also find me as a therapist at www.therapistinstlouis.com. Thank you for joining me, and stay kinky, St. Louis.